Well, this class is really about a great discovery that actually changed the way people thought about the past. And this is the story of the Rosetta Stone, how it was discovered, but more to a point, how hieroglyphs were deciphered. Deciphered means to understand. So, for example, you may have difficulties in deciphering my handwriting because it's not terribly good. But deciphering means to understand a particular language or form of writing. Well, as I said in the last class, 1801, the British government basically took control of Egypt. The French army was kicked out. The savants were sent back to France. The British government then took control of all the antiquities that the savants had collected. The savants were allowed to return to Paris with the drawings and copies of everything they had found, but all the antiquities that Denon and others had collected were basically left in Cairo or in Alexandria for the British to take control of. And one of the one of the antiquities that the British now took control of was a large piece of black stone which had been found when the French were building a fort at a place called Rashid. We know it better as Rosetta, at the mouth of the River Nile. The French had started building this fort when they realized the British might be coming to invade the country. This large piece of stone measures 1.14 by 72 centimeters. It's a single piece of a black stone, a type of stone we know as basalt. It's very hard. It was found by French soldiers when building the fort, and the officer in charge of the soldiers, when he saw this, immediately realized its significance. The Rosetta Stone, as we call it, has 3 different forms of writing on it. 3 different types of script. And the officer who found this could see that the first of the scripts used here at the top was in hieroglyphs. The second was in what was known as demotic. This was already recognized as being the language of the common people of Egypt, but it still wasn't properly understood. And the third one was in Greek. These are what these scripts look like. Hieroglyphs, composed entirely of symbols. Demotic, letters to a certain extent, and Greek at the bottom. And demotic was known to be the writing of the common people of Egypt because you find demotic writing on papyrus, and we get the name demotic from the Greek word demotikos, meaning popular or of the people. So the Rosetta Stone had these 3 forms of script. Any form of writing using the system of alphabetical or other characters. The hieroglyphs, the Greek hieros, sacred, and glyphos, demotic from the Greek word demotikos. Well, hieroglyphs could not be read. Demotic, it was thought, was probably a form of the Egyptian language known as Coptic, the language used by the Christian population of Egypt at this particular time. Greek, of course, could be read. And when the savants looked at the Greek inscription, they realized the real significance of this particular stone. The Greek text ends by saying that all 3 inscriptions on this stone were, the Greek word is for equivalent to each other. Equivalent. Not word for word translation, but they have the equivalent meaning in these 3 different scripts. But before the French could start work on this, the British arrived in 1801. The British took control of it, and it was sent back to London. The French were left with their drawings in a single copy. Well, the moment the Rosetta Stone arrived in England, people realized its potential significance in England as well. Yesterday News for paper report, 1802, and it gives a whole load of stuff there. But it refers to the Rosetta Stone here. 3 inscriptions in different languages. The Greek could be read. The Greek was talking about a gift of corn from the ruler Ptolemy Philadelphus, who could be dated to 196 BC. The Greek inscription was a law concerning the supply of corn and things like that. And as this newspaper points out, the first inscription is in hieroglyphics, the second in Old Coptic, Demotic, and the last in Greek, which meant that it would be possible to see that these were translations of the same text. Well, the Rosetta Stone arrives in 1802. Demotic was recognized as almost certainly being the same as the Coptic language. What very few people realize, unless you read the newspapers, is that the Christian population of Egypt represents something like 10 or even 15%. They speak a language we call Coptic, which is not Arabic. It was believed that Coptic must be the modern version, or the existing version, of the ancient Greek language, of the ancient Egyptian language. But the Christians of Egypt have been writing Coptic using Greek letters from the 3rd century after Christ. They didn't use Demotic, so nobody could actually read the Demotic itself. As for the Rosetta Stone, on display in the British Museum from 1802, it's not until 1814 that somebody decides, perhaps I'll take a look at this and see if I can translate it. The person we credit for first working on the Rosetta Stone is this man here, Thomas Young. Thomas Young was a very remarkable character. We can call him a polymath. He was a master of many things. He was a medical doctor by training. He worked as a medical doctor. But he did lots of research into things like vision and light, solid and fluid mechanics, philosophy, music. He considered his own greatest contribution to science, to knowledge, if you like, the wave theory of light, the idea that light travels in waves. His other second great discovery, as far as he was concerned, was he was the first person to identify the problems of red and green vision. Some people can't see red and green, and he did a detailed study of this. But he was also interested in languages. He did lots of things as a full-time doctor. And in 1813, he wrote a very important paper in German, in which he analyzed a whole series of languages throughout Europe, and he identified what we call the Indo-European language group. The Indo-European language group consists of a wide variety of languages which are all related somehow. Sanskrit, Urdu, not Finnish, Swedish, German, Irish, English, French, they're all related. Hittite, the language of the Hittites of Anatolia, is an Indo-European language, although he didn't know Hittite at that particular time. Well, he wrote this paper in 1813, and he concluded it with the comment that, oh, hieroglyphs, yes, well, they're bound to be something like an alphabet script. Well, an alphabet script, we can identify an alphabet script because in all known languages that use an alphabet, the maximum number of characters you will find is about 30 or 35. I can't remember offhand how many there are in the Turkish language, but there are 26 in English, so it must be 28 or so in Turkish, with A, B, J, Ch, etc. So 26 in English, about 28 or so, 29 in Turkish. When Thomas Young wrote this in 1813, it was just a throwaway comment. You know, just being a bit big-headed. Oh, well, hieroglyphics won't present any problem to anybody. But then in 1814, somebody said to him, well, why don't you translate the Rosetta Stone? So he said, well, I'm having a month's holiday from my work as a doctor and research in light and vision and everything else I do. He went to the British Museum, he made a copy of the Rosetta Stone and took it away on holiday with it. And he started to study it in detail. How he began to analyze the stone was basically by looking at the Greek text on the stone, where he could identify the name of the ruler. The ruler Ptolemy, in Greek Ptolemaios. What he reasoned was that if these scripts are equivalent to each other, then you should find the name Ptolemy the same number of times in each script. So he counted the number of times he could find the name Ptolemaios in the Greek script, and then went through the Demotic script, found sequences of letters that occurred the same number of times as Ptolemaios in the Greek script, and then started looking at the hieroglyphic text to see if he could find exactly the same thing. And in this way, he was able to work out two very important things. First of all, here you have Ptolemaios in Greek down here. He could identify Ptolemaios, a group of symbols and letters that occurred in Demotic the same number of times as in the Greek text, and from this identify a group of symbols in the hieroglyphs that turned up the same number of times. But he also realized that if this was the name of Ptolemy, it was contained within this particular curved symbol, which he called a cartouche. So he made a second great discovery, which was that basically a cartouche must indicate a royal name. He worked on the basis, he believed that the hieroglyphic script was an alphabetic script, even though there were quite a large number of symbols. He worked on the basis that the hieroglyphic symbols must represent the same sounds in Greek as in Ptolemaios. So he could read this as Ptolemaios. There should be two S's there. But then he found that there were certain groups of symbols with the name of Ptolemy with extra letters. He couldn't get very much further with this. So he made this really quite important discovery, that you could actually identify the name Ptolemy or Ptolemaios in Demotic, in hieroglyphic, and obviously in Greek. He could identify a cartouche as being a symbol that enclosed a royal name. He then went on to look at other examples of cartouches on the stone and was able to identify the name of Ptolemy's wife, Berenica. Well, these are very important steps because this gave him the phonetic value, the sound value of certain hieroglyphs. Then he started looking at the Demotic script in more detail. And he made the very exciting discovery that, or working on the basis that the Demotic script was the same as the Coptic language, he discovered that a Swedish scholar had already started looking into the same thing. This puts out the values, phonetic values here. Not necessarily Ptolemaios, like that. A Swedish scholar had already made the discovery that the Coptic script uses Greek letters, but it uses 6 additional letters which are not found in Greek, which must represent sounds in the Egyptian language which don't exist in the Coptic language, in the Greek language. And this scholar, Johann David Åkerblad, was eventually able to work out a list of equivalent values of Demotic symbols to what their Greek values would be. This was a very important thing, because Jung then went on to discover that when you looked at the hieroglyphs more carefully and compared them with the Demotic letters, you could see that they were very similar, which meant that they had to have the same sound value, that they represented, he thought, that they were actually an alphabet. So that this must represent the letter H, that's the letter H, R, N, M, and so on and so forth. Well, now that he had a phonetic value to several of the hieroglyphs, he began to believe that his original idea that hieroglyphs were an alphabetic script was true. He started to work more and more on the hieroglyphic alphabet, but then he began to realize that there were problems in all of this. What made him realize that hieroglyphs could not be an alphabetic script was in reading the last line on the actual inscription. Here we see it split into three parts. Here we've got the Greek, the Demotic, the hieroglyphs. And what he found was that where the Greek talks about an inscription, or the Greek equivalent, you have that symbol. This is an ideograph. An ideograph is a symbol that conveys a sound or a meaning. How can I make that clearer to you? We all know what that is. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These symbols have completely different sounds in other languages. It's an ideograph. It gives you the idea of something. The dollar symbol, the pound symbol, the euro symbol. The moment you see these, you know that this means dollar. It's an ideograph. What this meant, as far as Young was concerned, was that the hieroglyphic language was not necessarily an alphabetic language, that it might be a purely symbolic language that only used hieroglyphs with an alphabetical sound, a phonetic sound, when written to give the name of something foreign. So the ancient Egyptians had to work out how to write the name Ptolemaios. So they said, oh, we'll use this, that, and the other thing. 1818, he's only been working on the inscription for about 3 or 4 years. Part-time, he's a doctor, a full-time doctor. He's a scientist as well, part-time. He decides he's gone as far as he can go. He has got away from the idea of thinking it might be an alphabetic script, that it must be a combination of ideograms, and perhaps it's only in a later period that the Egyptians would use hieroglyphs to indicate letters. So he decided to publish his results in 1818 in the Encyclopedia Britannica. In his publication, he gave us suggested vocabulary in English for some of the demotic words, some of the hieroglyphs. He gave the equivalents of 218 demotic words, 200 hieroglyphs as well. He also made the point in this article that the hieroglyphs were ideographs. Essentially, they were ideographs, but some hieroglyphs did have a phonetic value. And it seemed that for later Egyptian writing, these hieroglyphs were used for writing the name of something that did not exist in Egypt, like the name Ptolemaios. Well, Young's publication of his results in 1818 came, as you will see, at just the right time in the academic career of this man, Jean-François Champollion. He was the last of 7 children, born in France. He did not begin his formal education until he was 8 years old. He was taught at home by his brother to begin with, but he showed an exceptional talent for languages. The sort of person that we all are very jealous of, a real master of languages. By the time he was 10, Champollion had learned Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. This was so that he could read the Bible, because the Bible in its original form was written in Greek. Even the Hebrew parts of the Bible were first written down in Greek and written down in Hebrew at a later date. He wanted to make comparisons between the different versions of the Bible, Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. For example, in the Latin and the English version and Greek version of the Bible, we come across the word virgin for Virgin Mary, the mother of God, the mother of Jesus, which implies that she had never had sex, you know. But in actual fact, in Hebrew it means a young woman. See, so there are differences in interpretation there. By the time he was 13, he was already describing the study of Oriental languages as his favourite passion. 1807, he's 16, he becomes a student at the School of Oriental Languages. He went on to learn Persian, Ethiopian, Sanskrit, Sen, the language of Northern Indian, Pahlavi, one of the languages of modern Iran, Arabic, Aramaic, which was the common language spoken throughout the Middle East in the late Greek, early Roman period, Syriac, which is a later version of Aramaic, and Syriac is still spoken in North Syria and, anybody guess where in Turkey? The Mardin area. Syriac is still spoken by the Christians in the Mardin area. Chaldean, another form of Aramaic which is spoken by the Christians in Iran and Iraq. And he did so well at all these that in 1809 he began to study Coptic, and he won a doctorate in languages for his abilities in that particular language. Well, 1809 also sees the appearance of this. When the savants were forced out of Egypt, they took with them the drawings and records they had made of all the antiquities they had seen. The French government, under Napoleon at the time, decided to publish these in what we know as the Description of Egypt. This is the front page of Volume 1, as printed in 1809. It continued to be published until 1822, by which time 23 volumes had appeared. The description included a very detailed drawing of the Rosetta Stone, with its hieroglyphs, demotic, and its Greek text at the bottom. Well, the publication of the description encouraged Champollion to start looking into studying Egyptology, ancient Egypt. In 1811, he published an introduction to Egypt. In 1814, Egypt of the Pharaohs. But he's busy being employed as a professor of history at the University of Grenoble, so he can't really do much about the Rosetta Stone, the hieroglyphs, until 1818, the same year that Thomas Young publishes his discoveries in the Encyclopedia Britannica. In that year, he's given a job as professor of history. So he can now devote his time to trying to understand hieroglyphs. Well, he'd been fascinated with hieroglyphs from 1809, when this was first published. He began to work, just like Young, on the basis that certain of the demotic signs represented phonetic values, sound value of hieroglyphics. He worked on the assumption that some hieroglyphs were ideographs, but even though they might be ideographs, they might have a phonetic value. That sign means $. He started to work his way through the hieroglyphs and came to the conclusion that the hieroglyphic script was partly alphabetical, but it used ideographs in combination with other ideographs to give different names. His big breakthrough, though, came when he was looking at another inscription altogether. On that inscription, he could see a cartouche. He could see these two hieroglyphic signs. Young had recognized these as representing the letter S when he worked out the hieroglyphs for the name Ptolemaios. So this clearly represented S. Champollion could see it was in a cartouche, so it must be a royal name with a letter SS. Champollion guessed that this was probably an ideograph, that it looked like the sun. He knew, because he'd studied Coptic, the Coptic word for sun was Ra. That gave him a sequence, Ra something SS. Well, many languages, many Semitic languages, don't have vowels in them. He assumed that this would be the something similar here, but he wasn't certain. It could be other letters were left off. He assumed that the most likely thing with a ra s at the end, the only royal name that would fit this was Ramesses, like that. What Champollion had shown with this first breakthrough, basically, was that hieroglyphs in ancient Egypt also had a phonetic value as well as being ideographs. This was a much more important step than Young could have possibly made. Young had decided that essentially hieroglyphs were mainly ideographs. A few of them actually represented letters. Champollion then went back to study, got my slides out of sequence, the demotic letters, looked at the similarities with the hieroglyphic letters. He could get the phonetic value of the demotic letters by comparison with Coptic, which gave him the phonetic, the sound value of these hieroglyphs, and then basically made his second big breakthrough. Hieroglyphs come, if you like, in 4 different ways. Back we go. Hieroglyphs, and I'm using this in English, this wouldn't be the same in ancient Egypt, but let's take this. It's an owl. How do we say owl? Owl. So that, as an ideograph, has got a phonetic value, the sound owl. He worked out from this that it represents an owl, the idea of the owl, but it has the sound equivalent to the word owl. He then realized it could actually be a logograph, that hieroglyphs could be combined to make other words. So, for example, you could use the hieroglyph symbol for owl with the hieroglyph equivalent of the letter B, and that gives you the word bowl. Or if you like, now this is all in English, I can't do this in Egyptian. You can use the ideograph with its phonetic value of an owl to give you the word towel. It's simple sign writing in many ways. You get the idea. It's an ideograph, an owl, the idea of the owl, but it's got a phonetic value, owl. You can combine it with other letters with phonetic values to make different things, but it also has a determinative value. It's used in hieroglyphs to mean I see. So in hieroglyphs, if you wanted to write I see an owl, it would be something like that. 2 owls put together. Well, this was really the big discovery that Champollion made. The hieroglyphs could work to represent a sound, they could represent a piece of spelling, they could represent an idea, they could represent an action. So they could be combined in very many different ways. Well, Champollion then had to actually test his developing idea of how to read the hieroglyphs. And his chance came when he was able to see a copy of this obelisk, now at Kingston Lacy in England, an obelisk which was taken from Egypt to England in about 1814 or so. The hieroglyphs, he had a copy of these. He was able to read this and say that this had been set up by the ruler Ptolemy VIII, king of Egypt at a later date, and his wife Cleopatra. So in 1822, and he's only been seriously working on this for a year or so, he's beginning to give phonetic sounds to hieroglyphs, he's beginning to see how they work, and in 1824 publishes his first description of how the hieroglyphic language works. His Précis du système hiéroglyphique in 1822 is the first hieroglyphic dictionary that we have. He's gone one stage further than Young. He needed Young's work in many ways to get onto the idea, but he's gone to that wonderful one stage further. Why is this such an important discovery? Well, for the first time, Scholars throughout the world had an alternative source of history for the classical period. There was the Bible, which gave an account, semi-mythical history of Palestine and the Bible lands. There were the writings of Latin scholars, the writings of Greek scholars. Now, it was possible to read the writings of Egyptians of the same period to understand their history, their view on the world as well. But in many ways, a thing that was much more important, let's just look at a couple more of his sketches, how he's actually working all this stuff out. Cleopatra in hieroglyphs, Cleopatra in Demotic there. But in many ways, the much more important thing about being able to read hieroglyphs was that for the first time, people could put dates to Egyptian history. This is in the sense that there was a source written in Greek by a priest called Manetho. In about 320 BC, he wrote his Egyptica, or History of Egypt, which included the names of all the pharaohs, the rulers of Egypt. It gave the number of years each one had been ruler. There is another version of this list in Demotic, the Turin Royal Canon, I'll show this in a moment, and there is an Egyptian list in hieroglyphs, the Abydos King list. But the thing is that once you could read hieroglyphs, then you could recognize the names of rulers on buildings. You could recognize who had built something. This is the Turin Royal Canon there, and this is the Abydos King list, which gives you all the names in hieroglyphics of all the different rulers of Egypt. What people could now do was go to something like the tomb of Ozymandias, look at the statue of Memnon that was there, and read the name Ramses. Manetho gives us the chronology. We know that Ramses lived about 3000 BC or so. So you can see why this is such an important discovery. Well, in 1825, Champollion, having published his translation of the hieroglyphs, is key to the understanding of Egypt. Dr. Young wrote to him to say, well done, you've done very well. You started work on this in 1818, which is when I published my account. Wouldn't it be fair if you put my name on your work as well? Well, Champollion said, yeah, forget it. I've done it all by myself. This is partly because of the tension between France and England. France and England have been at war so many times. France and England have only just completed one major war. But it's also because of Champollion himself. A young person wanted to get all the credit for his own self. This sense of tension between who discovered how to read hieroglyphs still exists. Now, I'm English. That's why I emphasize the work of Thomas Young. If I was French, I would emphasize the work of Champollion. 10 years ago, there was a display in the Louvre Museum about the Rosetta Stone and the translation of it. And on one side, they have a painting of Thomas Young, and on the other side, they had a painting of Champollion. And all the French visitors came out complaining that the painting of Thomas Young was bigger than the one of Champollion. And all the English visitors said the painting of Champollion is bigger than the one of Thomas Young. They were exactly the same size. So that sort of sense of tension still exists. Well, Champollion did all this work without ever going to Egypt. Studying the records of the savants, looking at copies of inscriptions. It wasn't until 1828 that he actually made his, this is his identification list of the different pharaohs, that he made his way to Egypt, where he stayed for 2 years, being able to identify a whole number of monuments that previously couldn't be dated. So, for example, the Great Tomb of Belzoni. All that Belzoni knew about the Great Tomb in the Valley of the Kings was that it was a tomb of an ancient ruler. Champollion was able to say from the hieroglyphs on it that this was the tomb of a ruler known as Seti I. And thanks to the king list of Manetho, he was also able to say that Seti I lived sometime about 1314, 1270 BC, and that Seti I was the father of Ramses, who built the tomb of Ozymandias. Well, Champollion's expedition to Egypt, 1828-1830, was, if anything, even more destructive than the work of Belzoni. Champollion was a linguist. He was only interested in getting hieroglyphic inscriptions. He went into things like the tomb of Seti I, the Great Tomb, and cut the hieroglyphs off the wall, sent one set back to the Louvre Museum and so forth. But the importance of his work was recognized in 1831 when he was appointed to a professorship in Egyptian history, the first one in the world, at the University of Paris. But he died 1 year later of a heart attack at the age of 41, probably a result of illness brought on from drinking dirty water while he'd been in Egypt. So his final publication appeared long after his death in his Monuments of Egypt, finally published in 1845. Well, Champollion's work on the Rosetta Stone gave us all the key to Egypt. Could he have done it without Young? Probably. But Young's work starting off to, first of all, identify what cartouches were, they contain royal names, identifying the first letters in the hieroglyphic language. Young's work in identifying similarities between hieroglyphs and demotic letters was a vital clue to what Champollion did. Well, Champollion died, as I said, in 1832. More recent research has shown that he was not entirely right. He was only 90% right in his understanding of the hieroglyphs, which is not bad when all is said and done. We also know lots of other things about hieroglyphs that Champollion certainly didn't know. Hieroglyphs have been around since 3400 BC. The Demotic script was actually developed sometime around 660 BC. And as I said in the last class, Herodotus was told in about 450 BC that nobody could read the hieroglyphs anymore. But hieroglyphs were still being used for writing down into the Roman period. Demotic only became changed into a Coptic alphabet after some Egyptians adopted Christianity sometime in the 4th century. Okay, we will stop there. Again, I might be a bit ahead of time. Oh, I am. Oh, you've got 10 free minutes. Right, sit here.